On an October day in 1904, 15-year-old Selma Leontina Seastead, Tina she was known, boarded the Ivernia, bound for Boston to meet her older brother Carl and head for New York City to begin a new life in America. Although her father, Gustav, a ship captain, had died early in 1897, Tina left behind her birth home at Amberg, her mother, Selma Laria, maternal grandparents, Ivan and Sophia Lundberg, and the bulk of her sisters, some of which would eventually also come to America. Did you ever wonder why people did this? Even more important, why would a parent or grandparent allow their child to sail across the ocean knowing they're probably not going to see them again? Millions of people almost at the same instant were making this same decision. Well, there are clues in the shoes, I believe, of the grandparents, and certainly in the passenger list of the Ivernia and other ships of the time. The Ivernia, launched in 1899, 13,799 gross tons, twin screw, 600 feet long, 64-foot beam, speed 15 knots, had the largest funnel ever fitted to a ship at 60 feet, which may well have contributed to easy identification and sinking by U-boat 47 in 1917. Of her 1,964 passengers, only 164 were first class, 200 were second, and a whopping 1,600 were in steerage. In fact, a check of the record shows many ships of this period were sailing to America with no middle-class accommodations filled at all. The answer to the disparity goes all the way back to the Silver Panic of 1873 and the successive 10-year shocks eerily similar to our situation today. Sweden's economy struggled to attain a growth rate of 4%, when we're reminded daily it takes 6% to maintain a healthy economy. And, let's face it, there was the blue blood problem. If you didn't have the bloodline to get into one of the monarch-backed guilds, you wouldn't be educated, and your life would be limited. But if you could get to America and understood its three-legged stool model of capitalism, an ownership society where you traded work skills for capital to buy real property and investments, you too could be independent. So they came, by the millions. And into this cauldron of humanity would come another Swede, 17-year-old Edwin Mattson, along with his sisters Anna and Helga, in 1906. By this time, Tina and Carl Seastead were becoming well established. Tina would go to work with the Van Werts. Frank T. Van Wert, a famous international teaching dentist of the times, and eventual president of the Columbia School of Dentistry, would send her to cooking school to become their pastry chef. And Carl Seastead was already working in the White House on the Theodore Roosevelt renovations as a finished carpenter, an obsolete term that means cabinet maker. For Edwin Mattson, things would be far different than the pictured postcards immigrants made for resumes. He took a picture of his first employee, cook on one of the Lehigh Valley car barge tugs. He was a laborer. He drifted. But one thing he did do right was join one of the immigrant play acting groups, the Court of Svea, where it just so happened there was another immigrant and her brother, Tina and Carl Seastead. Evidently, the play acting life suited him. He was soon on the picnic committee. There was a time for love. And in 1916, with Reverend Jacobson officiating, a marriage. The witnesses, Carl Seastedt and Anna Mattson. The date, September 23rd, 1916. The place, Brooklyn, New York. They were now the Mattsons, a partnership in every respect. They were taking in everything New York had to offer. His jobs got better. They were making money, banking money, and having fun. So when a young Ed Mattson Jr. came calling in September of 1917, he was working perhaps his best job, machinist at the Empire Welding Company. Who knows exactly when they began paying attention to the advertisements. There was a land boom in Florida. Why prices are doubling and tripling by the week. Don't be left out. And best of all, at Groveland, Florida, you can buy a sapling grove with a house, and in 10 years it'll be self-supporting, and in 20, full production. Don't be left out. Why, sir, this is no idle speculation. This is investing. Don't be left out. And hundreds of Swedes are doing it. By the time young Carl Arthur joined Ed Jr. in the household in May 1920, they had their house and grove paid for and were ready to head south. Once again, they were shipboard, this time bound for the Jacksonville wharves and a connection with this steamboat, probably the May Garner, for a 193-mile journey up the wild St. Johns River to the Sanford Landing, where the Mattsons and their impromptu nanny, Anna Mattson, Edwin's younger sister, boarded the narrow-gauge Orange Belt Railway for the 70-mile train ride to the Groveland station. There were a lot of disgruntled Swedes milling about, and it was here that Edwin Mattson learned that he'd gone from grove owner to real estate dupe by his mere arrival. His and their contracts for deed and deeds were simply works of fiction in most cases, as was the town. They were trapped. Groveland was a booming sawmill town feeding off the worldwide frenzy for cypress pencils in this dawn of the age of accounting. Two fixtures were the Arnold Sawmill and the Edge Mercantile Store, between which virtually all needs were supplied. Their immediate need was shelter. Here. At the time, this was a ramshackle building that was the Edge feed store, and right in the back here was where they rented the space to stay. Even still, they were better off than most. At least they had protecting angels. Her old employers, the Van Werts, quickly sent down payment money for any suitable property found. They purchased a pitiful plot of 120 acres on the eastern shore of Lake Catherine at the North City limit. It had a precious few rows of producing orange trees surviving from the 1895 freeze. But it did have a mule barn, ramshackle cabin to live in, and most important, a chicken coop. We have a scarce few pictures of what those early years of survival were like as the boys grew. With salvaged lumber, they started building a house, completed over the next 25 years. As for any grove, it would have to be planted, and for that you need money. Enter the chicken. Begins laying at 16 weeks of age, lays as many as 300 eggs per year, will live as long as 6 years, and at a time when hungry sawyers ate eggs, bacon, sausage, or biscuits twice a day, it was a perfect cash cow. They were egg farmers. By the time Edwin's other sister, Helga, nicknamed Dolly, came to visit with her 2 boys and hotelier husband, Roy Baker, they were in full egg production. But there was trouble. Anna was terribly homesick and had begun losing weight. Home meant Sweden. But how do you go home when home is an impossibility? She's buried in the Groveland Cemetery. The following year, the Arnold Sawmill burned to the ground. To make ends meet, Edwin Mattson went back to being a laborer, this time building the massive Polk Hotel in Haines City, Florida. A new sawmill was begun in 1926, and Edwin Mattson could be a farmer again. The boys were in school and could now speak English. 3 years later, so could he. The real estate bubble burst. But with Charlie's help, he had been able to get the entire property planted. They now had a real grove. On a trip into town, someone excitedly ran up to Edwin and exclaimed, "How much money did you lose when the bank closed, Mr. Mattson?" It was October 1929, and this depression thing was on. The following year, Walter Ronald Mattson was born. During the nation's long 11-year economic winter to come, Roy and Dolly Baker would help immensely by marketing the Mattsons' fresh navel oranges in New York via their Miami hotel. The 30s were busy years. The older boys could now help with the grove work. They were all busy building up their Lutheran church, and the Swedes together were draining the swampland and turning it into productive grove land. As some fell prey to the Great Depression, Edwin was able to acquire tractors, John Deere Model A orchard versions, and start a grove service for extra income, which made Charlie happy. Throughout this period in Europe, there was a World War I corporal with a penchant for soaring oratory who had deluded a great number of people into believing in something he called National Socialism, sold as a full employment society, but in practicality, a dictatorship where the only freedom was freedom of worship for the dictator. The world soon learned Germany had elected a monster. Upon graduation, Carl Arthur Mattson, Art as he was now known, joined the Navy. At 21, he was already an old man to the young recruits he was training as aircraft mechanics at the Chicago Navy School, when the goose-stepping corporal's ally, Japan, attacked Pearl Harbor and Clark Air Base in 1941. Within weeks, he was in Pearl Harbor, assigned to one of the few methods the Navy had left for defense, long-range seaplanes. Under the Each One Teach One method, the last crew trained took the next on their Pacific air routes. Thus, the whole squadron learned the Pacific quickly. In the early war, they attacked shipping. In the late war, they carried cargo for the island-hopping campaign. They were the most heavily loaded seaplanes in combat, with a 16,000-pound load. At maximum, the squadron flew 1.8 million plane miles a month, carrying 6.4 million tons a month, mostly at night. 1942 was a busy time for Ed Jr. as well. He joined the Navy, married Marit Peterson, and the following year, the Mattsons were grandparents with Ruth. Ed Mattson Jr. would go on to serve on Navy transports and LSTs as a radio operator in what would be some of the most hazardous duty of the war. With World War II came the need for canned orange juice to supply the soldiers with vitamin C, a proven scurvy preventative. And Edward Mattson made a prescient decision, joining a co-op with a collective 1/10 interest in the Winter Garden Cannery. From now on, he had a quota to fill instead of searching for a market. He had made his decision, and Harry Truman made his, dropping 2 bombs rather than wasting millions of lives in a fruitless invasion. The boys came home. Ed Jr. would take over the Grove service and have 3 more children, Kenny, Paul, and Ann. Art Mattson would marry Betty Vickers and become Claremont Chief of Police, South Lake Deputy, and Game Warden, all rolled into one. By 1952, it was Walter's turn to serve in the Navy aboard this escort in Korea. By 1957, when Carl Arthur Jr. was making his appearance, Walter was becoming an attorney, and the Mattsons were settled into the role of grandparents and elders in the Zion Lutheran Church. By 1961, Edwin had bought his finest car, a Ford Mercury. It had air conditioning, but wasn't so extravagant as to have power steering. He wouldn't use it long. He was becoming forgetful. When urged to make out his will, lest the government take everything he'd worked for, he replied, "That would never happen in America." He did so, but didn't have it certified. He began to lose touch with reality, was diagnosed with hardening of the arteries. What we now realize is Alzheimer's disease. I'll tell you a quick story about him. I believe this is their last picture together. He's in full dementia now. He slipped out of the window one night, early in the morning, ran away from home, site of the present Lake Catherine Blueberry Farm, and headed north on Highway 19 in the dark, roughly 5 miles to the intersection of Highway 27 and 19, and ended up in a orange grove. I believe my cousin Paul was the first family member to come in contact with him, but by the time we got there, the sheriff was there, the media, passers-by, people taking pictures. I can remember my father assuring the orange grove owner that we would pay for everything, but he wouldn't take a dime. Said he hadn't seen anything like that since he was a child. I can still recall the odd sensation of standing amidst all those huge pyramids of oranges, lined perfectly, as if a surveyor crew had done it. I can't tell you all that goes through a man's mind near the end, but I can tell you that on March 5th, 1966, Edwin Mattson had an appointment to keep.
This way, Miss Mattson. Watch your step.
Within weeks, the Internal Revenue Service would declare Edwin Mattson had died intestate and would demand a tax equal to 80% of the appraised value of the groves. And so it fell upon Selma Leontine Mattson to fight for the property through her 3 sons in court. In 1968, they settled a one-time cash payment of $80,000 to the Internal Revenue Service to retain ownership of Mattson Groves. In her 80s, she became a child of the 70s, loved the large family gatherings that Walter and his wife Shirley and their large family provided. She was the old lady on the dock in a straw hat with a cane pole fishing for bluegills for supper. She had lived from the steam age to the space age and had known Civil War and Vietnam veterans alike. During her final year, she began complaining of headaches, and when quizzed by the doctor, it was found she'd been having the headaches for at least a year before. She was diagnosed with brain cancer, and though she began the treatments and assured us everything would be fine, you and I both know how this ends. And Connie and I have been pleased to bring you her story. All over the world, 24 hours a day, researchers, genealogists, historians are placing their pictures online, which makes the telling of these immigrant stories possible. And in that same spirit of cooperation, we are placing this film in the public domain.